Good afternoon and welcome to our TV show featuring documentaries revealing the realities behind myths using research and scholarship. I'm your host, Ergün Kırlıkovalı, and I will be with you every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. You're welcome to send me your feedback at mythsandrealities.com. In episode 50, we have seen how Boghos Nubar Pasha, the head of the Armenian National Delegation at Paris Peace Conference, revealed in a 1918 letter to the French government that, I quote, "The Armenians have been, since the beginning of the war, de facto belligerents, as they have fought alongside the Allies on all fronts, enduring heavy sacrifices and great suffering," unquote. No word about the claim of systematic extermination by the Ottomans, none. Nubar repeated these confessions in a letter to the editor of the Times of London, published on January 30th, 1919, where he wrote that, I quote, "The Armenians have been belligerents de facto since they indignantly refused to side with Turkey," unquote. He said the Armenians' faithfulness to the Allies ended up causing the Armenians unspeakable suffering and dreadful losses. Again, no word about the claim of systematic extermination by the Ottomans. In Palestine and Syria, Nubar said, where the Armenian volunteers played a large role in the victory of General Allenby. And in the Caucasus, 150,000 Armenians in the Imperial Russian Army and more than 50,000 Ottoman Armenians, volunteers, contributed to the Ottoman Empire's loss of a great portion of Eastern Anatolia. While Nubar was revealing these well-known facts, he was striving for a place at the Paris Peace Conference table. Little did he know that they would amount to a massive Armenian confession. That the Armenian suffering was not due to a systematic extermination campaign by the Ottoman government as deceptively and persistently claimed, but it was due to the treasonable acts of most Ottoman Armenians, as in siding with the invading enemy armies. These two Nubar letters sum up why the Ottomans, who were fighting for their survival on 5 fronts, while also combating a widespread Armenian insurgency at home, had to move out of the war zones the Armenian rebels and their logistic base so that the latter could not resupply and assist the rebels. It was a wartime military measure taken to mitigate a wartime military threat, purely in defense of Turkish homeland. There are many more cases of mass relocation in counterinsurgency warfare. To select the Ottoman relocation of Armenian insurgents out of the lot, as if with tweezers, distort the facts surrounding it, and attach the false charge of systematic extermination to it, when Armenian leaders themselves confess publicly that the Armenians were de facto belligerents, can only be explained by a strange blend of Western prejudice, Orientalism, ethnic discrimination, religious bias, racist propaganda, and incessant Armenian political pressure and demands. In episode 51, I have explored with you yet another major Armenian confession, that of the first Prime Minister of Armenia, Hovhannes Katchaznouni. In the Armenian Revolutionary Federation has nothing to do anymore, the Manifesto of Hovannes Katchznouni, translated by Matthew A. Callender, edited by John Roy Carlson and published in 1955 by the Armenian Information Service in New York, Katchaznouni relates, and I quote, "At the beginning of the fall of 1914, when Turkey had not yet entered the war, but had already been making preparations, Armenian revolutionary bands began to be formed in Transcaucasia with great enthusiasm and especially with much uproar. The winter of 1915 and the spring of 1915, the winter of 1914 and the spring of 1915 were the periods of greatest enthusiasm and hope for all Armenians in the Caucasus. We had no doubt that the war would end with complete victory of the Allies, Turkey would be defeated and dismembered, and its Armenian population would at last be liberated." Unquote. Katchaznouni points out that Armenians had embraced Russia wholeheartedly, as they believed without justification that Russia would grant Armenians a self-government in the Caucasus and in the Armenian vilayets liberated from Turkey as a reward for Armenian loyalty and assistance. Katchaznouni maintains that Armenians had created a dense atmosphere of illusion in their minds and implanted Armenian desires into the minds of others. He affirms that Armenians had lost their sense of reality. "I want to carry it away with dreams." I quote, "We overestimated the ability of the Armenian people, its political and military power, and the extent and importance of the services of our people rendered to the Russians. And by overestimating our very modest worth and merit, we were naturally exaggerating our hopes and expectations." Unquote. Katchaznouni claims the mass exiles and massacres which took place during the summer and autumn of 1915 were mortal blows to the Armenian cause. He adds that half of historical Armenia, where foundations of Armenian independence would be laid, was denuded of Armenians. I quote, "The Turks knew what they were doing and have no reason to regret today. It was the most decisive method of eradicating the Armenian question from Turkey. Again, it would be useless to ask today to what extent the participation of volunteers in the wars was a contributory cause of the Armenian calamity. No one can claim that the savage persecutions would not have taken place if our behavior on this side of the frontier was different." Unquote. Here, Katchaznouni seems to ignore the fact that during the ARF Party Annual Congress in Erzurum from July 19th to August 2nd, 1914, the Turkish delegates offered autonomy to the Armenians if Armenians could help the Ottoman army to conquer Transcaucasia by provoking a rebellion in Russia. This was one step above the Armenian reform package, which was already established in February 1914. Source: Esat Uras, The Armenians in History and the Armenian Question, published in Istanbul in 1988, page 842. Historical evidence shows that if Ottoman Armenians did not take up arms against their own government and join the invading enemy armies, then there would be no need for relocations and massacres. By purposely resorting to armed insurgency and treason, Armenians destroyed their own peace, prosperity, and dreams, not to mention harmony in Anatolia. No country would allow an armed minority in its midst to stage open rebellions. I quote, "The struggle that began decades ago against the Turkish government brought about the deportation or extermination of the Armenian people in Turkey and the desolation of Turkish Armenia. This was the terrible fact," unquote. Katchaznouni's conclusion is supported by Louise Nalbandian's book, The Armenian Revolutionary Movement, pages 67 to 89. The Zeitun Rebellion of 1862 was the beginning of massive uprisings directed against the Ottoman government. After establishing many secret and violent societies, like the Union of Salvation, the Black Cross Society, the Protectors of the Fatherland, the Armenakan Party, the Hunchaks, and the Dashnaks, and staging hundreds of bloody uprisings, assassinations, raids, bombings, and finally committing supreme treason by joining the invading enemy armies, Armenians sealed their own fate. Turks only defended their home. Katchaznouni continues, I quote, "Civilized humanity might very well be shaken with rage in the face of this unspeakable crime. Statesmen might utter menacing words against criminal Turkey. Blue, yellow, orange books and papers might be published condemning them," unquote. Here, Katchaznouni is referring to officially sanctioned diplomatic documents published by a government to promote their position on events. In World War I, almost all of the major powers had their own color book, such as the British Blue Book, the French Yellow Book, the German White Book, the Austrian Red Book, Russian Orange Book, and more. These were crude propaganda tools, stereotyping events, individuals, groups, and even entire nations. Imperialist, colonialist, and racist views would be presented in such books as state policies. They would fail to comply with today's standards of rule of law, democracy, human rights, civil rights, and critical thinking. Unfortunately, some Armenian historians today still promote the British Blue propaganda books as a reliable source of information. Katchaznouni adds, I quote, "Divine punishment against the criminals might be invoked in churches by a clergyman of all denominations. The press of all countries might be filled with horrible descriptions and details and the testimony of eyewitnesses," unquote. Western media was not much concerned with accuracy at the time. Armenian activists would pass their racist stories defaming Turks to missionaries and diplomats, who then would feed the Western press such embellishments. There was no sense of fairness, honesty, or integrity in the press. For example, the almighty New York Times published 145 anti-Turkish stories and embellishments in 1915 alone, and you know how many chances they gave to Turks to rebut them? You guessed it, 0. Going back to Katchaznouni, I quote, "Let them say this or that, but the work was already done, and words would not revive the corpses fallen in the Arabian deserts, rebuild the ruined hearths, repopulate the country, now became desolate. The Turks knew what they ought to do and did it," unquote. Yes, Katchaznouni, Turks knew what they had to do. They had to defend their home. They had to die doing it. They had to fight against the treacherous rebellions, dastardly treason, and brutal foreign invasions to save the country. Turks were ready to die for their country, and they did just that. More than 3 million Muslims, mostly Turks, died in too many fronts. 1.2 million of them alone in Eastern Anatolia, and 580,000 of those at the hands of Armenian revolutionaries. But you cannot find such information in the color books of state propaganda or the columns of the almighty New York Times. Katchaznouni writes, and I quote, "The second half of 1915 and the entire year of 1916 were periods of hopelessness, desperation, and mourning for us. The refugees, all those who had survived the Holocaust, were filling Russian provinces by tens of hundreds of thousands. They were famished, naked, sick, horrified, and desperate floods of humanity, flooding our villages and cities. They had come to a country which was itself ruined and famished. They piled upon each other before our own eyes, on our own threshold, dying of famine and sickness. And we were unable to save those precious lives. We were angered and terrified." Unquote. These are terrible times indeed. The suffering is real. But here's the catch. Most of what you hear here can be applied to Muslim suffering too. Take Katchaznouni's words above, word for word. They describe the immense Muslim suffering in Anatolia, especially the 800,000 Muslims driven from their homes in the Caucasus at gunpoint by the Russians and the Armenians. While the Armenians described above were fleeing north to Caucasus, Muslims, mostly Turks, were fleeing south to Anatolia. It is this part that is censored in the West. No one knows about Muslim suffering. They think we're making these things up. I don't blame them, as they are bombarded with Armenian propaganda and embellishments all their lives, where the other side of the story is silenced. Katchaznouni says Armenians blame the deceitful politics of the Russian government. From total ARF faith in Russia yesterday to total ARF condemnation of Russia today. From one extreme to the other. Each was equally blind, each was equally groundless. He argues that ARF was, forgetting that Armenian cause was a trivial phase for the Russians. So trivial that if necessary, the Russians would trample on Armenian corpses without a moment's hesitation. I quote, "We drew such conclusions as though Armenian cause was the center of gravity of the Great War, its cause and its purpose. To complain bitterly about our bad luck and to seek external causes for our misfortune. That is one of the main aspects of our national psychology, from which, of course, the ARF is not free. One might think we found a spiritual consolation in the conviction that the Russians behaved villainously towards us. Later, it would be the turn of the French, the Americans, the British, the Georgians, the Bolsheviks, and others. The whole world was to be blamed." Unquote. Katchaznouni exposes the bitter fact that ARF did not have the courage nor the ability to declare an open dictatorship, but did not wish to remain within the parliamentarian limits either, and tried to establish in Armenia a party dictatorship disguised as a democracy. He says an intolerable dualism resulted from it. On the surface, the parliament and the government; behind the scenes, invisible, the party and its organs. There was no parliament. It was an empty form without content. The problems of state were being discussed and solved behind closed doors, in the rooms of Dashnak faction, and then declared from the rostrum of the parliament. I quote, "The Armenian-Turkish War, which broke our back, began in the fall of 1920. Would it have been possible to evade it? Probably not. The crushed Turkey of 1918 had recovered during the 2 years. There came forward patriotic young Turkish officers who formed a new army, a Turkish army in Asia Minor. There remains an irrefutable fact that we had not done all that was necessary for us to evade war. We ought to have used peaceful language with the Turks. We did not do it for the simple reason that we had no information about the real strength of the Turks and relied on ours. This was a fundamental error. We were not afraid of war because we thought we could win. With the carelessness of inexperienced and ignorant men, we did not know what forces Turkey had mustered on our frontiers. When the skirmishes had started, the Turks proposed that we meet and confer. We did not do so, and we defied them." Unquote. I agree that ARF should have sought peace with Turks, and if they did, they would probably find peace, avoiding needless suffering. I also agree that ARF was too overconfident and arrogant to seek peace with Turks and had no idea about the resourcefulness of the Turks in warfare. Here are more revelations from Katchaznouni. I quote, "Armenian army was well-fed, well-armed, and well-dressed, but it did not fight. The troops were constantly retreating and deserting their positions. They threw away their arms and dispersed in the villages. Our army was demoralized during the period of internal strife, the inane destructions, and the pillages that went without punishment. It was demoralized and tired. The system of roving bands, which was especially encouraged by the ARF, was destroying the unity of the army and its defense, and that was a surprise to the government. The government and the ministers of war did not know their own army." Unquote. Katchaznouni recounts that on December 1st, ARF delegates signed an agreement with the Turks in Alexandropol. Same day, Vratsian government resigned and relinquished its power to the Bolsheviks, who then entered Armenia without meeting any resistance. He says there were two reasons for ARF to act this way. First, ARF could not resist even if ARF wanted to do so. Second, we hoped that the Soviet authorities would be able to introduce some order in Armenia, a thing which ARF all alone had failed to do. And it was very plain already that ARF would not be able to do so. In the spring of 1919, Katchaznouni affirms that the Paris delegation of Armenian Republic presented a memorandum of our demands to the Paris Peace Conference jointly with the national delegation of the Armenians in Turkey. In that memorandum, Armenians claimed a huge territory from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean and from the Karabakh Mountains to the Arabian Desert. He asks, and I quote, "Where did that imperial, amazing demand emanate? Neither the government of Armenia nor the ARF had envisaged such a childish and foolish plan. I was told that if they did not demand those fascinating frontiers, the Turkish Armenians would sever their cause from that of the Republic of Ararat and will apply to the powers accordingly. Our delegation was also told that America would not accept a mandate over a small Armenia, but would accept one over a from sea to sea Armenia, unquote. It appears that Katchaznouni is misinformed about the American mandate. The U.S. sent 2 missions to the Ottoman Empire in the summer of 1919. King Crane Commission visited mostly Arab lands, and I covered it in episode 47. General Harbord visited Eastern Anatolia, but not Van or Bitlis, where the Armenian atrocities were the worst. I covered General Harbord's report in episodes 48 and 49. Harbord relied on Niles and Sutherland's report for that Van section, but misrepresented it with comments like their findings were similar to his. This was not the case because the 2 reports were diametrically opposed to each other. They observed that there were numerous atrocities committed by Armenians and that Muslim resentment was profound. Niles and Sutherland also described thorough devastation of many Muslim villages. In the end, both King Crane and Harbord suggested that the U.S. have 3 mandates over Armenia, Istanbul, and the rest of Ottoman Empire, as a mandate on Armenia only was not feasible. There was no mention of U.S. mandate if only if Armenian territory is sea to sea. After this episode, we will examine Katchaznouni's manifesto as it relates to the Paris Peace Conference and the Lausanne Treaty that followed it. Thank you for joining me, and see you next week.